When the daylight fades and the quiet stirs, we gather in the hush between heartbeats, where stories breathe in the dark. Each tale, a flicker of memory, a dream half remembered, or love that refuses to end. This is Tales Before Dark. Written by Craig R. Mitton. Narrated by Jutus McGonigal.
Chapter 1. Paige. Now I'm reading romance novels. Paige Andrea Scott was born on October 17, 1992, into an already happy family with 2 brothers and 1 sister. She was brought up deep in the suburbs of Halifax, Nova Scotia, by parents who were neither rich nor poor, but were members of the shrinking middle class. Paige's childhood was far from extravagant, but she never really wanted for anything either. Many would say Paige was born a hopeless romantic, or is it a hopeful romantic? She never went through the poi cootie stage and got her first kiss in grade 5 over a love potion she had created in her mother's kitchen. By the time high school started, Paige was more than ready for long-term relationships, a couple of which she became engaged to be engaged, complete with a ring out of a candy machine in the first case and made from a garbage twist tie in the second case. While the loss of virginity was not quite as romantic as she wished for, she was at least in love with the boy to whom she gave it at age 15. It was punctuated by a visit to the circus afterwards. In her 20s, Paige was impatiently awaiting Mr. Right, while assuming she would be married soon. After all, she had been voted as the most likely to be married first by her graduating class. She waited, but he never showed up, although through some misty recollections of one-night stands and one failed relationship, she prevailed. That is, until one of her friends suggested finding a guy online. The internet gave her access to the world. Could there be a better way to find her soulmate, wherever he was? He came to her in the form of Mike from Toronto, and he was Mr. Romance, at least in the beginning. So began the late-night chats, an exchange of numbers and social media accounts. The telephone calls quickly led to talk of the only possible evolution of their burgeoning relationship. They had to meet in person. It was decided that meeting halfway was the only fair option. Unwilling to drive through Quebec, Paige took a train to Montreal to meet him. He would drive from Toronto and pick her up. She would never forget coming up the escalator into the hotel above the train station. He was quite a bit heavier than she had imagined, but she discarded that thought immediately. Wasn't that the point of meeting on the net? To put aside all the physical crap and go straight for the vital stuff like soul connections? Sex was overrated anyway. It quickly became apparent that Montreal was much too big for their first meeting, and the solitude needed for their romance to grow. Luckily, Mike knew the perfect place just over the border in Ontario, a little city called Cornwall, on the St. Lawrence River. She quickly agreed, and he drove them to the Lighthouse Motel, near the bridge that led to the United States. The door to the room shut, and the focus of their immediate attention became the bed in the motel room. Of course. The first time is never perfect, despite all the propaganda in romance novels, but sex is overrated anyway, right? What's chemistry when you have romance? Thus began 4 days of bubble baths, showers for 2, long walks along the river and boardwalks, and cuddling. It was perfect, and Paige's love of falling in love was falling for Mike. And then it all came to an end, and he dropped her off at the train station in Montreal. Paige watched the rain that held off for their entire vacation run down the train windows on her way back home, despite a few texts as they went in opposite directions, and even shed a few tears. After being together for so long, being apart was unbearable. It felt like breaking up. That is, until she truly discovered the power of goodbye. The aching in her heart at missing him was as powerful as the ache in her heart when they were together. Her addiction to overwhelming waves of emotion, flooding her psyche, could still be satisfied. And so, it would continue for 2 more years, with trips back and forth, sometimes going to each other's home cities, sometimes meeting somewhere in the middle. She took him to the Bay of Fundy and Cape Breton, and he took her to Niagara Falls and the Bruce Peninsula. Eventually, this would become tiresome, and it was time to move their relationship forward again and move in together. In the end, they decided that she would leave her beloved Halifax and move in with him, but the important part was that they decided together to move in. Right? Initially, it was paradise. Paige found a job that made her happy, and she loved playing house. There were even plans to get married and live happily ever after. But relationships require effort, and living together demands even more. The intense feeling of missing each other, which once fueled the fire, was no longer present. Their relationship had become real life. It was no longer a fantasy. They fought over money. Be honest, who doesn't? They fought about the future, and eventually, they just ignored each other. One day, Mike left and didn't come home for 5 days. In the meantime, Paige tearfully packed her car back up, left the job she loved, and began the long drive to the East Coast. They never spoke again. 5 years had gone by, and while her heart would heal, Paige would never dare give it away again. Friends tried to set her up, but it never went past the first date. How could anyone ever be attracted to this sad, tiny girl? She certainly never went searching on the internet again. Now we fast forward to June 21st, 2030, in Cornwall, Ontario. Paige Scott let a smile chase across her eyes and twitch her lips. She dragged her long, highlighted blonde hair out of its constrictive ponytail while an almost animalistic noise escaped her throat. Once upon a time, she had promised herself that she would never drive across Montreal, much less the province of Quebec, ever again. But here she was. 14 hours ago, she had pulled her car out of her driveway in Halifax with the intent of spending her 2 weeks vacation on Cape Breton. Still, somehow, when the time came, she found herself turning northwest toward the rest of Canada instead of northeast toward the Cape. It was almost as if she were reliving her only chance to restart her life. God help her if she referred to that time as her glory days. The last time she had left her beloved Nova Scotia to live elsewhere was the time she had gone to him. The road she had taken ended the words trust, love, and forever out of her vocabulary for, well, forever. Upon seeing a sign announcing that she was entering the province of Ontario, Paige rolled her window down and screamed, "I'm free!" into the rapidly darkening sky. Her wild, almost white blonde locks flew wildly around her face, while her blue eyes lit up with intensity. "Well, relatively speaking anyway," she murmured as she rolled back up the window and increased her speed to rather dangerous but delicious level, especially considering the highway was still wet from an earlier shower. Yes, she was free from Quebec, where her French speaking and reading skills were nowhere up near to the challenge, where everything was Saint this or that. All of the highway signs were logically in French, and she always had this sinking feeling that she was missing something fundamental. Paige had even once thought "Où est la chambre" was "where is the bathroom," not "where is the bedroom." She could only imagine the look of delight on the face of some guy when she asked that at a remote gas station in the middle of the night just off the Trans-Canada Highway between Quebec City and Montreal. All of this had led her to drive through Quebec as quickly as possible, with a maximum of 2 gas stops, where she murmured merci a few times and tried to escape without making a complete ass of herself. So why inflict this on herself again, especially when it was so completely unnecessary? When it gave her so much stress and preyed so hard on her increasing anxiety that she tried so hard never to acknowledge, much less show. Why? The last chance at love, at the white picket fences, at happily ever after. Why? Well, because of him, of course. The last time she had driven this way, going west at least, she had been full of dreams and hopes that were all coming true with every kilometer she drove. She was on her way to meet the man of her dreams, and they were going to move in together, get married, have the 2.5 kids with the 1.5 dogs in the yard behind that white picket fence. What could be more perfect? I mean, seriously. Yet here she was, a mere 5 years later, retracing the steps of that and so many earlier journeys to see him. Her dreams of love and happily ever after ran down the windshield with a few scattered raindrops. Her heart was almost as cold as the winds buffeting her car. Just the memories of those dreams made her utter a sound somewhere between a snort and a sarcastic chortle. But she knew she was going to take the upcoming highway exit to Cornwall and go to that same motel that they had stayed in all those years ago. She knew she was going to request that same room that they'd once made love in after long walks along the St. Lawrence River together. Because after all, what was life for anyway but to torture yourself as often and as brutally as possible? 40 minutes later, Paige was indeed throwing her suitcase on the queen-size bed in the exact room they'd stayed in together. Yes, she had actually found herself requesting it at the front desk, much to her dismay. One would hope they had changed the sheets a few times since then, but it was undoubtedly the same bed where they'd once enjoyed many nights of intimacy. The best sex she'd ever had, if she was honest with herself, had been those wild nights filled with emotional abandonment. She giggled when she remembered she still had a scar on her left shoulder from falling out of the same bed during one of those sessions. She had cut herself on that same beat-up bedside table that stood before her now. If she looked carefully, it probably still bore a scar matching her own shoulder from the incident. And if she wandered just a few more steps, she would see the tub they once had bubble bath fights in, not to mention the shower curtain rod she had held on to while he slid. Well, she wasn't quite ready to bring those memories into high-definition color. Instead, she turned on the TV, just as her father always taught her to do, so that anyone outside would think the room was occupied. She then turned around and walked back out the door. It was a decision that would save her life. Paige looked up and across the parking lot to see the brightly lit sign of a local fast food restaurant. Yes, that was what she needed right now, food. Then it would be easier to make decisions. She had just started to walk across said parking lot when she noticed it was suddenly getting brighter, which made no sense at all. The sun had just set. She looked skyward as the moon suddenly grew larger, then split in half with a terrifying crack that nearly deafened her. The wind suddenly shrieked across the lot, bringing clouds at a speed she could only barely comprehend, much less believe. When the ground began to shake, Paige fell to her knees, tasting blood on her lips. She honestly could only think, "What the shit?" But only a scream was left in her mouth when she tried to speak. When the shaking stopped, she slowly and shakily got back to her feet. Mentally, she went over her body looking for injuries, and miraculously found none aside from a split lip. Visually scanning her surroundings, she found almost nothing familiar. The fast food outlet she'd been walking toward was nothing but an inferno now. Both the well-lit factory and the bridge to the states beyond were gone entirely. That bridge had been full of cars. The mall to her right was nothing but rubble and flames. Scariest of all was that there was no sign of another human being. Still in a daze, Paige shivered and realized the temperature was falling rapidly. It was already much colder than it should be on a humid July evening in eastern Ontario, much colder than it had been only a few minutes ago. With a deafening crack of thunder, lightning struck the mall's ruins. Rain began to fall in blinding sheets. Cold and wet, Paige knew she needed to find shelter immediately, if not sooner. Wrapping her arms around herself, she started to walk back to the motel, which also seemed to be missing. She only hoped she could find her car.